Hello, in Beijing, can you hear us?
Hold on.
Yes.
Can you hear us, Beijing?
Beijing.
Can hear you.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. Yes, so I just wanted to start off and make sure I show this thank you slide. So thanks everybody for organizing, for inviting me, and especially to all the students from Tsinghua and IOV. Wish you could all be here, from those of you who are in Beijing, or we could be there. So next time, let's do it that way. And I'll jump into the beginning now. So going from where we were last time, right? We kind of covered basic neural networks models, or really just neuron models, but these are the building blocks of neural networks. And I'm going to tell you about something I'm interested in now because I think it's just a math that can be used to describe neural networks and really do a theory that hasn't been done before. So what I'm going to go through first is just a very brief overview of some of the theory for ANNs and some puzzling observations, and then I'll dive into what I'll focus on mostly is this kernel theory, which I think is an exciting way of studying neural networks, artificial neural networks. Okay, so what is an artificial neural network? Well, last time I talked about the perceptron, right? Which you can think of as one neuron, so maybe this output neuron, and a way to update and learn its weights, a sequence of data, labeled data. Now, real neural networks that are used for tasks are multiple layers. They're not linear classification or they can nonlinear things. So we call this a multi-layer perceptron. I don't want to get into all the gradient descent business, but your rules similar to networks. What are some theories that have been around for a while? Well, we've known for a long time that these things can approximate basically any function you want. So for Boolean networks, the McCulloch-Pitts results said that you could learn any Boolean function. And then in the late 80s, there were theories that showed that networks that had nonlinear transfer functions could approximate any function. I want to point out they're not statistical results that explain learning. They're just about there exists some network that can approximate any function. Doesn't tell you how much data you need to actually fit that function or how hard that might be. And then there was also a whole series of work that's more from the physics side. So a lot of statistical physicists in general, and some of them are now or were then neuroscientists, worked on learning curves, so kind of how error depends on the number of data points, et cetera. And one I'll point out is Elizabeth Gardner, who kind of was instrumental in starting that theory out. And she died at a young age, unfortunately. So, but many of these techniques, replica symmetry stuff, was based on. Okay, so what's a typical statistical learning theory? So, like most of you, I was not trained in machine learning as my main thing. I was more of a physics and applied math background. But the idea is you have some data set, right, with n data points. So maybe you have some x's, and this is supervised learning where you know the labels of the things you're trying to predict. So say images and labels of cat, dog, whatever. And ask questions, please, if you get stuck. You have what some people call risk, but basically you can think of this as error or loss of your model, which is this function h on this data set. So when h of x doesn't match y, you incur some error, right? And you just average that over the training data set that you have. And the idea is you pick a model h that's in your class of all possible models, big H, that minimizes this risk over your data set. And a typical result would be that, okay, how well will my model do on new data or when I test it? How big the error is compared to the training risk is bounded by something that's like the complexity of your class of functions you're learning. So maybe we can relate this to the structure of the network and something to do with the size of the data set, or sometimes these terms are stuck together, complexity and size of the data set. And the way you can measure complexity, well, it's sort of how complicated types of what kind of complicated functions can you fit? How complicated is the class? So one version is VC dimension. Okay, so why is this not good enough? Well, what we're seeing now with deep learning is some surprising behavior. So the classical picture is that you have maybe different types of H that you could use to learn some problem that you order by increasing complexity. And as you make more complicated models, your training error will go down, right? So that's this dashed line, the training risk. And what will happen is if you're choosing too complex of a model class, at a certain point, your testing error, which is also going down at first, because you're underfitting if your model is too simple, your testing error will start going up, and there'll be this sweet spot at the minimum of that test error, and then you want to use a model that's that good. But what people see with deep networks, for example, is behaviors like this, where as they make bigger and bigger networks, they go through that U-shaped regime, but then there becomes a point where they actually start to get the error going down again. So people call this double descent. And we're starting to understand why this happens, but initially this was kind of a big surprise for a lot of people. Are there any questions about this picture? Yes.
Can you give an idea why does it happen?
Yeah, so why does it happen? Well, it can be a number of different reasons, actually. So say the complexity of your model is the number of features you're using, and you have a data set size n. Okay, so I have 100 data points, pictures of images of cats and dogs, say 100 images, and I'm making my model bigger and bigger by adding more and more features, more neurons to my model. It turns out I'm going to get a peak when I have 100 features in my model, just due to the fact that I'm to fit the model to this data. I'm more or less inverting an 100 by 100 matrix, and that matrix is very close to singular at that point. And then as I add more features, it will be non-singular. It's actually singular all through here too, but non-singular, but better conditioned. So the condition number of that matrix is changing. Does that help? Yes.
Could one also say that when the training cost hits zero for the first time, that's the point where it's just possible to hit all the training examples perfectly, zero loss. Only just possible. You have to use every bit of freedom in your parameter space just right to achieve that. And then you have no flexibility. Choose a model that's likely to have a good generalization behavior. Whereas once you go past that threshold, you can start using your extra degrees of freedom in sensible ways. And that might be a way to get the.
Okay, so this question is about interpolating the data. Yeah, so this is completely irrelevant. Yes. So right at this point where the peak occurs, they say here's the interpolation threshold. So that's like right when you can perfectly fit your data. And yeah, that tends to be where this peak occurs. But look, classically, you actually don't want to perfectly fit your data, right? That's the classical situation, is you actually want to not perfectly fit the data because you'd be fitting to the noise. But in these deep models, the best performance tends to occur out here where you do perfectly fit the data and you go past and you're perfectly fitting it somehow better. And it's unclear how that was occurring. Yeah.
How was the model able to continue learning after the training error was effectively zero? Like what signal is it getting to do that?
That's one of these questions that people are confused about. It's like, why does it do well with zero training error or not? Yeah. And in some situations it doesn't do well. But I don't have the answer to all these questions, but just one example. Beijing, you're welcome to chime in. And another interesting phenomenon that people saw, so this is a cool paper, I think I put it on the reading materials, was that here you're seeing the error of a network. I think this is just training error. And over training steps, so steps of gradient descent. But it's an image data set, true labels, and then randomizing the labels. And so they're showing here that even in when you randomize the labels, so pictures of cats are labeled dogs and pictures of dogs are labeled cats completely at random, that you can get to zero error with these networks. So what that means is that the networks are very flexible as a class of functions. And so really those complexity bounds that I was saying really tell you nothing here about the behavior of these networks. Okay, so lots of other puzzles. One of them, how do you optimize in these large high dimensional settings? I'm not going to to what functions it's good for.
In the previous slides, the double descent, this was for deep networks, right?
It's sort of a generic picture. Yeah.
You need to have like a number of layers with this double descent or.
Well, you can actually get double descent in a single layered network. You can get it in linear regression, in fact. Yeah. So lots of the theory that's been done now is really just for a single layer and in linear regression. So we're going to get into this thing that I'm going to call kernel theory, and I'll explain what this is, and it's a way of explaining some of these things. But a big question for a long time in neuroscience and learning is like, does a certain network structure work, right? And we dynamics, and then we can also see that in the learning system. Okay, so more math. This should be hopefully familiar, but inner products, right? So say I have some vectors. I'm going to call it A and some other vector B. Choose a different color. I'll get this out of the way. Oops. And let's think about first having these be finite vectors. So I'm in a finite vector space. So if I look at the inner product of A and B, just to remind you what this is the adding entries multiplied by each other. All good, familiar with this? Thumbs up if you are. Okay, good. Right, so this is telling you something about the magnitudes and the angles of these vectors. So angle theta between them, it's going to be 0 if they're at right angles, right? Just to remind you also, this works for functions. So if I have two functions, f and g, that are square integrable, say, I can define an inner product on these functions, which is I integrate them against each other. Oh my. What happened there? Uh-oh. I don't know what just happened. Never this happened before. Through the panic. May need to computer. It's ever applied to an artificial recurrent model. Actually, this is sort of one of these. I'm not sure if double descent's been observed in recurrent models. Does anybody know? But that's possible. Yeah. Okay, so I'm reconnecting to Zoom and then things will reappear. Hopefully it doesn't happen again. I don't have open. This thing will disappear. With a so delta x, that's the spacing of the points. Everybody good with this? Okay, so last bit of math is what is this kernel and what am I talking about when I say kernel? So yeah, we have our neural network. We've got an input that's a vector, okay? So we've got a bunch of features that are the input features. And now my network is just going to be a simple 2-layer network. You can generalize this for many layers if you want. And each of my features in that network, my neuron computes a nonlinearity, H. And the nonlinearity is applied to the dot product of that neuron's weights. So I have a neuron I here, and it takes a dot product with X or an inner product with X. Way. A, B is the same as A transpose B if they're vectors, finite dimensional. Okay, so the idea is we're going to actually assume that this weight matrix W at this stage is drawn randomly somehow from some distribution. So each neuron's weights, neuron I, gets a random set of weights. Actually, doesn't really matter what distribution for this kernel thing to hold. To look at is we take these features and we form a vector. So I'm going to call that capital Phi. And this would be the vector of features here for an input X. For convenience, I'm going to drop the vector symbol on it here. And we're going to look at that as an inner product with itself. Okay, so we have two inputs. So as for two inputs, X and X prime, how similar are they basically? Okay. And then for convenience, by M for features in that layer. Okay. So what is this? Well, it's a sum from I equals 1 to M of phi X, phi X prime. Okay. And since I put this 1 over M in front, it's an average. Okay. And since it's an average, it's going to converge as M goes to infinity. In some sense, it's going to converge to its expectation. So this is the law of large numbers. Averages converge to their expectations, okay? Since these things are IID, these are IID random variables, independent, identically distributed functions. And just to be clear, what is this expectation? Well, it's integrate this H of W transpose X, H of W transpose X prime against the probability distribution or the measure of the weights, which are, I guess, L dimensional here, or L plus 1 if you have a bias. And that's what we're going to call the kernel. And the kernel if you do all this averaging, it really only depends on X and X prime. So it's a way of evaluating the similarity of 2 points, 2 inputs, X and X prime. Does anybody have questions at this point about these steps? Okay, hopefully that means it's clear. All right, so this is what I mean by kernel for a network. And all I had to, the key thing I had to assume was that the weights of this layer here are random. I didn't say anything about how those features are read out. Okay, so those can be learned. Okay, so it's just a totally stupid network. Okay, good. There's good question. Yeah, so the idea is we sample a network with these random weights and they're fixed from that point on. So maybe we learn some readout and then do the kind of standard supervised learning paradigm of training and testing. Yeah. You can do the other thing, but it wouldn't have any good performance. If you randomize the features again, and the readout's going to be terrible if you use the same one. Okay, so this idea has been around actually for a long time, but it really only gained popularity recently in the deep learning area or machine learning area. Okay, so I don't want to belabor these points. These are kind of technical points, conditions that the kernel has to satisfy. But some of your homework will be to look at some of this stuff. What you can think of is any kernel that satisfies these technical properties, which ours does for network, is a way of computing the similarity between 2 different inputs, but in some nonlinear space. Okay, so these psi's here represent moving into some new space. And many machine learning algorithms are built off of this idea. So some examples, say your kernel is just linear. This is a kernel that's linear, and okay, that doesn't actually move you into any different space. You're just working in the input space. Or you can like polynomial inputs and work with that. Or you could work with comparing inputs in some nonlinear way, like computing their distance and then passing it through this Gaussian bump function. That's another valid kernel. Probably familiar for those of you who've taken ML. So what does those kernels have to do with neural networks? Well, actually, the linear one is what you would get if your nonlinearity H was just nothing. It was just linear. But some nonlinear ones, say you sample your weights from a Gaussian and your nonlinearity is somehow kind of a Fourier function like a cosine, then you actually can get this radial basis function bump kernel out. And that's your homework number 5, is to use that on a real data set. And you can get this kernel to be calculated for a nonlinear transfer function. Okay, so, and a nice property of these kernels is they have this eigendecomposition where you can write them in a basis E that's really useful for working with. So you can use this E basis to do all kinds of theory. Okay, so big picture, what is in machine learning? You can think of doing a task as approximating some function. Okay, so you have some function you can think of as a vector, but in a function space. Okay, so we have some target we're trying to approximate, which is my network is supposed to approximate the function that takes in images and tells me if it's a cat or a dog or whatever, which might be a very nasty function. Well, the network, when you pick the structure of weights and you choose the weights randomly in this way, nonlinearities, gives you a way of finding this eigenbasis, right? Which is a basis for that function space. So it's like rotating from some other basis into this new basis E, or from E into this new basis. Oh, I changed the notation. It's okay. So I guess the E's are applied to the green arrows here. That are scaled by the eigenvalues. So I guess I should say my eigenbasis is E1, and this would be my lambda 1, and this would be my E2, lambda 2. Some directions are more important than the others. And the performance of my network on the learning problem relates to how well my target function F overlaps with the large eigendirections versus the small ones. So if my function F is pointing along the direction of this leading eigendirection or to learn versus this other direction too, this is all theory that something here is actually fairly old, and I didn't really work on myself, but I'm working on applying it now to neural networks. Okay, so what can we do this for? What is it useful for? So this is a collaboration with these fine people from Colombia. I'm not sure if the chat is something that I should be paying attention to, but so Marjorie is the lead. Sam helped out with part of the project, and we all wrote it. Ashok is Marjorie's advisor and was heavily involved with the whole project. So we just got a preprint up on this if you're interested. Okay, so we were inspired by the cerebellum, which is an area that's related for motor control. So this is starting to connect now to like a example. In people who are like science, they do it. And if you drink alcohol, your thumb is known is to be part of the problem. The reason why you'll stumble that was imposed to keep your trajectories from being crazy. Okay? Well, how does the network look? So there's an input layer that's called the mossy fiber layer, has a lot of inputs. Those fed into these granules there. Taking the granules are sort of these things. It's kind of a layer network. That's what we're changing the nonlinearity, but via the threshold. Okay, so how come people thought sparse coding was optimal? Well, a lot of these theories were developed for tasks which were things like random categorization. So where you had a random set of points that had random labels of I'm supposed to categorize them as red or blue. So think dogs or cats, right? Plus or minus one, like the perceptron. And what people saw was as they, across different numbers of patterns, it didn't really matter. The optimal coding level was somehow low. And there's theory that explains this. But for things with you could vary how smooth they are, right? So we have a way of doing that in this Gaussian process task. So when we have very unsmooth trajectories, it's best to stay sparse in your activity, using a low coding level. But as the task gets smoother and smoother, it's better to have a higher coding level. So we wanted to explain, first we found it, like good to point out, and we wanted to use the theory to explain it. This is just a fake model, by the way. It's not anything to do with motors for a smooth task. But then we also built a more real model. So you saw this already in Alea's talk for a two-joint arm, and actually produced motor trajectories. And the goal of the network was to take in the current state of the arm, so XY positions, angle in angular coordinates, angular velocities, and some control variables. So we're pretending it had some torques that were applied, and predict the next state, basically, the angles of the next state. Okay. We see the same thing. Yeah.
First of all, the H will rectify linear functions.
Yeah, what are the H? The H's are rectified linear. Yeah.
So you just change the threshold, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and the coding level is what?
Coding level we're defining as a fraction of the cells in the granule cell layer that are above threshold.
On average over your x's? On average over your,
Yes, averaged over the inputs. Yeah. And averaged over cells and inputs is my cell over threshold.
so basically it's theta, it's related motion theta, this coding level.
Yes, there's sort of a sigmoidal relation between theta and
What are the neurons? What are they? Exactly.
so the granule cells are outputting this random representation of the input. The Purkinje cell is going to be, it gets trained through learning to basically regress out those motor variables at the next time. So it's in a sense, it's like you're trying to predict where your arm will be at the next time so that you can do predictive control. That's the abstracted version of this problem. That makes sense? Other questions? Yeah.
You just explain the intuition why you get more error like this U-shaped pattern.
Okay, yeah. So the U-shaped pattern, let's see, is it best to? Okay, so let's think, okay, if my coding level is really low, okay, so my threshold is basically really high. Okay, so the left here would be large theta, and the right would be small theta. So in the very small theta regime, so high coding level, my neurons are all basically linear, right? So if in the limit of theta goes to negative infinity, every neuron is above threshold, which is not at 0.5 actually. That's out here at 1. We didn't show past 0.5, but the network becomes linear. At 0.5, the peak is due to kind of a degeneracy of the ReLU. So it's sort of a weird thing. Maybe I'll come back to that, but at very large theta, right, the error would be high because basically all my neurons are 0. Okay, so that's the intuition. Yeah.
Yeah, but what if you have like a system that you have to approximate to make prediction with multiple time scales? No? The network is able to make prediction.
You're saying like, what if I added in like at plus, I don't know, 2 delta and 3 delta and stuff like that? How well would that do? We didn't look at that. This system is actually pretty much, I think it's linear, except for no, it's not entirely linear. We didn't linearize it. Is that? Not in the joint angles. Yeah, there's sines and cosines, right? But over short time scales, it's basically linear. So a lot of this is reflecting how linear that function is. Okay, so yeah.
So just to clarify, so if the network is completely linear, not work because you have more time points, infinitesimally small time points than neurons. Why? And the mapping is nonlinear.
Mapping is nonlinear. Yeah. So we're trying to learn a nonlinear
More
function.
time points than neurons. Number of bits is essential.
We've discretized it though, so it's basically one step. So there really is no time here.
Why can't you have sufficiently large numbers of them? So the next point in the linear network.
Because we have finite training data here. And the dynamics are actually nonlinear.
The problem is not the ability of the network to express the right solution, rather it is time it takes to learn.
So this is just for some fixed number of training data, this picture. Yeah, so like 100 examples. So pretending that the cerebellar, our model of the cerebellum, the Purkinje cell only gets 100 feedback things.
The story of Purkinje and granular, this is just, a story to explain the mathematical equation, but from the point of view of the mathematical equation, it is a finite nature of training.
Yes, for this error to not be zero. Yeah, as the number of training points increase, the error will keep going down in this set.
Relating to that question, like linear, it means that like actually you cannot do better reading directly from the mossy fibers. No,
This is true. Yeah. Yeah. If it's truly linear, you wouldn't need this at all.
count. I mean, you can have as many as granular cells as you want, but
And yes. Mhm. So there's no reason for the network if it's a linear problem.
so the number of mossy fibers and the small number of mossy fibers is critical.
Compared to the number of granule cells.
No, in the linear regime, what is critical is the number of mossy fibers.
Oh, yeah, for the problem to be learnable.
Very small, otherwise I could have a linear without directly converting.
Right. So you're saying like if I have 7,000 mossy fibers
Yes,
and I have 100 data points, I'm not going to be able to learn. Is that what you mean?
yeah, depends on the problem, like probably. The problem is that it's not linearly solvable in the with that number of mossy fibers.
But the number of data points is finite.
Yeah, typically it's small. Yeah, we vary it across these experiments, but if so, that would mean this there would be you're below the interpolation threshold in that case, or yeah, you're below it.
You're right, it's what makes it multiplied. It's numbers.
But in any case, it's a nonlinear network. Okay, cool. So what happens is you change that threshold. Yeah.
There's a question.
Oh, good.
The weight distribution and how the type of weight distribution affect.
Okay, so in this setup, we're assuming that W, all the entries of W are from a Gaussian. And we do that because it's theoretically advantageous. But we also make we do a bunch of experiments that I'm not going to show here because I don't have time to talk about them all, where we change that assumption. Because in reality, these granule cells are fairly sparse in the number of inputs that they receive. So it turns out this theory kind of works reasonably well when those assumptions are broken. Does that get all the points? Cool. I'm glad there's lots of questions. Okay, so you change that threshold, right? You're going to change the kernel. So here you see a couple different kernels. F of 0.5, this is coding level, is threshold of 0. It's the same thing as theta equals 0. But you're seeing the different kernels here. It turns out in this case, they're only a function of dot product between inputs. So I can make it look like this. And we can also, because theories for kernels are out there, predict the generalization error of this network as a function of the coding level now by varying the kernel and the number of data points P. So, as I add data points, the error goes down here, right? So this is a slightly different setup than the ones I showed you before, which is why the curves look a little different. But the theory, which is for the expected error, squared error, matches pretty well. And you can see it relates the coefficients of my basis functions, which are spherical harmonics in this case, and the eigenvalues of the kernel. And these C1 and C2 are complicated, but we can compute them.
Question, so,
Yeah.
in your previous slide, this
With numerical quadrature, yeah. So there's some analysis that we can do too. Yeah, it's like semi-analytic.
calculate the kernel.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and the And next slide, that's when the inputs are on the unit sphere, or
Yes.
what if they're
If they're not, we've done those experiments when they're not. And qualitatively, you get the same kind of curves of error versus coding level where you see typically optima at higher coding levels than very sparse, except for very, as long as the tasks are smooth enough. Yep.
The task, where is it now? Like,
What is the task
where
here?
is, no, where, yes, exactly. What is the task and where is,
It's one of those Gaussian process tasks.
okay.
Yeah.
And where is the dependence on the, I mean, there's more than the task, where is it? In this?
It's not on this picture. Or where is it in here?
Yeah.
So C, these are the coefficients of the target function. So this is your task. So we have a task as some function we want to learn. We expand it in some basis, which are functions that look like this, and we get these coefficients, and the error depends on those coefficients. Yeah.
if the function is not in the kernel space, then these are the coefficients of the projection, the composition.
These are coefficients in the L2 basis of spherical harmonics. And since this C2 here is greater than 0, this sum is always going to converge, actually. So it doesn't, the theory will work even if it's not in that space. Yeah. So for the function to be in the space, you need that C alpha squared over lambda converges. But when you add this C2 in the denominator, you're kind of forcing it to converge. Although this is also squared in the denominator.
Is it trigger what you get as it's not in space?
By solution, you mean an expression for the error?
Yeah. No, I mean
We should talk about this later.
Okay.
Okay. So this theory is out there, and here are the references for those of you who are interested. Okay, so very quickly, we have an hour plus time for questions. So I want to tell you a little bit about this second project, but before I go there, are there any other questions about this sparse coding idea? Yeah.
Yes. Do you think like you use like heterogeneous values for the activation threshold? So you change the distribution instead of the value. Would you obtain like better performances or?
Yeah, so changing the threshold, having each neuron have a different threshold.
Yeah.
So we did some experiments like that where the individual neurons have different thresholds. Qualitatively, we've seen the same thing. They're not trained though, remember. So the weights of the neurons here are just drawn from some initial distribution. We're only training a readout, kind of a perceptron type readout. Well, really it's doing regression, so not classifier. We don't see big differences though when you get a distribution of thresholds. So we checked that. Okay. Okay. So this is a different. This is now another sort of random network where we build in some structure. So there we didn't really have any structure. We just added threshold. It turns out in the ML literature for these kernels, nobody had done that yet. So it was kind of a low hanging fruit. Now, this other thing is about actually changing the structure of the weights to look like the kinds of weights that you would have in a GLM model of a receptive field, for example. And this is work that was led by Barrage. And then Marius gave us a bunch of data, which was great. And Bing Brunton, who was my postdoc advisor when I started this, was Barrage's advisor too. But I kind of, I guess, led the paper. And it just got accepted to PLOS CV. So in this setup, we're thinking about receptive fields, right? So you're all familiar, I think, with receptive fields. If you're talking vision, this is what is the visual stimulus that causes the neuron to tend to fire. You can estimate them many ways, like spike triggered average, and they tend to look like little edge detectors like Gabors. Maybe a system you're less familiar with is this insect haltier system. So haltiers are these little pendulum shaped things. which are where there used to be wings on a fly. Lots of flies have them. This is a crane fly that has a very big one. And as the fly flaps around and flies, these things bob up and down. And they use them to sense gyroscopic forces. So when they twist in the air, the haltere gets deflected, and there are sensory neurons at the base that get stretched, and use that to sense those forces. And if you wiggle them experimentally, you'll see that they're sensitive to certain temporal frequencies. They're also sensitive to direction too, but it's all mostly mechanical. But you see receptive fields, which are frequency selective and highly variable. So essentially what we do is we model the receptive fields as the weights. So the input is either a time series or images in this setup, and a neuron I receives, sees that input and weights it with weights that are meant to either be spatial or temporal. And we model those as from a Gaussian process with some parametric function. Maybe that's not important, but you know what that is. Good. So in the temporal task, say, here's some biological receptive fields in B, and we can model them with this Gaussian process model and sample them, and they look quite a lot like the biological receptive fields. And we have one parameter here, which is frequency, that we can change. And what we see, okay, so say I have a task, which is to disambiguate two signals. Purple signal, where I have some frequency that's being carried, there is some noise, and just a noise signal, black. Okay, so my model network is supposed to decide whether there's that frequency or not. Turns out that's actually nonlinearly separable. And what we see is that if you give them those weights that look like the haltere weights, which are going to be frequency selective, you get much better performance. This is as a function of how many cells I have in this network. So a small random network can work really well. And to make something a little more complicated, we created this frequency XOR task where it's supposed to decide, there's two frequencies now, whether or not they're in there or not. So it's 0 if there's neither of those frequencies, so it's just white noise. 1 if they're both, or 0 if they're both in there, and then it's one if one of the frequencies is in there, but not the other. And whether or not this works kind of depends on whether the frequency selectivity of the random features is compatible with the task or not, right? Because if my neurons are all sensitive to frequencies that are outside the relevant range, then it makes sense that it wouldn't work very well, right? So we do that. And what you can show mathematically is that you're filtering out these irrelevant components of the stimulus. So these frequency detection tasks, there's a certain frequency where the red points are showing the things I'm supposed to care about versus the ones I don't care about. And then the other frequencies are all just noise. They're not relevant to the task at all. And so in a sense, you're filtering out and reducing the dimensionality of the problem. And you can do the kernel theory with this and show that in an exponential reduction in the number of data points you need to learn because you're working in a much lower dimension. So you're kind of fixing the curse of dimensionality. And then the visual case, so these are just Marius's data. So these are estimated receptive fields from a mouse. We have lots of them, I think about 8,000 neurons. You see they're actually a little bit more noisy than a nice Gabor filter looks like. And so that's why we modeled them randomly. Here's our modeled receptive fields. We've got 2 parameters which define like field size and spatial frequency. You can do the math and figure out that these are Gaussian processes in kind of a wavelet space for meat wavelets. And you get the same kind of stuff, you know, if you do a machine learning type of task where you're trying to predict what the label of some digit is. And it's the same math though as before in terms of why it works. The kernel theory is telling you you're working in a much lower dimensional space, which is in this sense relevant to images because images are built out of little edges, right? They're not just arbitrary high frequency features. You're going to learn a lot better in that sense. Any questions at this point? Okay, we're getting close to the end. And it turns out in this setup, so the way I build the network here, I have my receptive fields. Here, they're all centered in the middle, right? But in reality, in our brains, we have receptive fields. We're kind of tiling the visual space with receptive fields, right? Different parts of our visual cortex are retinotopic to certain areas in space. And those weights are not shared, right? It's not like a ConvNet where the weights are shared. There's different neurons in different locations. And so we did that in this model as well. So we actually sample the centers uniformly random within the visual space for this model. So it's not convolutional. Because of that, it's kind of hard to train because you have lots of neurons and they're not with shared weights. So it turns out if you initialize the network with our V1 type weights, it will train faster too than the other setup, than if you just use unstructured weights. But it doesn't actually work when I threw that into AlexNet, which is one of these convolutional neural networks. And I think that's just because the weights are, there's so much weight sharing that you really don't have such a high dimensional set of weights to learn. And then I'm going to skip this. Okay, so this kernel representation of random networks, I think is interesting from perspective of neuroscience and machine learning, because it's telling you about which functions a network finds easy versus hard to learn. And it lets you do the theory of that. And yeah, I think, I guess this is, yeah. So structuring the way the random weights are set up is kind of giving you information, right? You're building in information or a prior about those functions, right? So it's useful in that way. And I should point out too, so those theories that I pointed to a while back, here, if you're interested in the double descent phenomenon, I'd recommend you read this paper from Cengiz Pehlivan's lab, where they show that you can actually explain you can get multiple descent, like rather than just a U-shaped curve, you can get curves like this with arbitrary many peaks. And each of those peaks is related to different frequencies of spherical harmonics out of this kernel theory. Okay, so this is just to wrap up. Thanks again, and I'll take any other questions. Yeah.
Maybe a basic question. So we use seem to be symmetric diagonal left and that's fine.
Yes.
Is any kernel specific, like with some asymmetric or asymmetric structure or some instead or some
Asymmetric kernels. So I know like people have tried using kernels that don't satisfy all the like technical requirements I was talking, breezed over for certain problems. They don't if they don't have the symmetric property. So I don't really know what those would be good for, but I know people have played with them. But you're never going to get something like that out of a one of these neural network kernels. Actually, that's one of the homework things I put on there, proving that the symmetry comes out. It shouldn't be too bad to do. Yep.
So you mentioned that the use of the kernel method can help to overcome the first dimensionality or bidimensionality problem. I didn't quite understand the connection between those.
Okay, yeah, so I'll just do this. So like, put this over, it's gonna work. So I have I'm trying to learn about some mapping from X to Y, right? X is in D dimensions. When D is really big, you're typically going to have some like U to D dependence on how many features, how much data you need to learn that an arbitrary function in that space. You can't get around this in general. So if you're trying to learn a function f that's just in L2, any function, you're not going to be able to do it unless you have exponentially many samples. So what I breezed over was that when you use these weights, for example, so the first part where I talked about sparsity of activity, that doesn't fix the curse of dimensionality at all. But it does change the kernel and change what's good to learn. These receptive field type weights do help with the curse of dimensionality. And the reason is when you sample your weights from a Gaussian process, weighting certain frequencies, for example, in the temporal task. So if my weights look like that in the temporal task, they tend to be very low frequency, right? And it's equivalent mathematically to projecting your input onto just low frequency functions and then filtering out all the high frequencies. So you're ignoring high frequencies. And so you're working in some dimension D prime that's like maybe a lot less than D. And so really it's a way. So when you have a deep network, right, and you train it, it learns some weights, and people go in and they look at the weights and they see they tend to be low frequency things, right? Little grids and little colored Gabor-ish things. Well, what those are doing is they're projecting to a low dimensional space of filters, at least lower than the starting dimension. So you're doing this like lower dimensional projection before you, in a sense, the theory says it's before you apply the kernel. So you're applying the same kernel in a lower dimensional space. No, I'm being sort of vague. At least you see this point about this versus just like arbitrary white noise. Other questions? Yeah.
We think of kernels, I guess, as like tools for just like as a tool for machine learning, or like as something that actually could be biological in some sense. And I guess in that case, it would be interesting because I guess normally you might expect that the brain reduces the dimensionality of things rather than sort of injecting things into like a larger, more complicated vector space.
So I think of these kernels. So we had to make a lot of approximating assumptions to get this theory to work, right? We had to like say things were random. But any network, say it's not just randomly sampled weights, right? Deep network, it's trained. You're creating feature representations, right? So all the kernel is just the dot product between feature representations for two different inputs. So it's telling you about the overlaps of different inputs, to use physicist language, overlaps. And those could be learned representations or not. It's easy to do the math if they're unlearned. And those dot products between representations are telling you about how well linear readouts will do. They'll tell you about learning with a linear readout. So I think that you can like develop this kind of theory more for like RNNs, which was suggested. And I think probably what's happening in a deep network, for example, that's fully trained end to end, is that the kernels are adapting to the problem. And there's been some recent work where people look at that as like you can derive a differential equation for the kernel function itself. Yeah.
Are there any questions from Beijing also?
Yeah, Beijing, please.
Yes, so is there any relation between neural tangent kernel and the kernel theory we talk here?
Yes. Okay, good. So you are familiar with neural tangent kernel. So the neural tangent kernel, let me just get somewhere to, so I have these references in the end of the talk that I didn't really show, but the neural tangent kernel is this idea of, I have my weights and I train them all, but my step size is really small. So my weights don't change that much from my initial condition. So here, we're only training the readout, so the features don't change at all, right? So the features are at the initialization of the network, but if you make your weights change very slowly, so slowly that they only change a little bit, you get this thing called the neural tangent kernel, which people have made a big deal about. And it's the same idea. Yeah. So except it's just a slightly different kernel. It's dot products, rather than dot products between features at initialization, it's the dot products between gradients at initialization.
I have a question. I was reminded kind of in this formalism because like we have these fields on the input space, it's functions, and then we compute the scalar product of it. Or at two different points, that's really the same thing you do for computing the 2-point correlation functions.
Okay.
Just thinking, is there some work which kind of uses this formalism of Feynman diagrams? Understand these?
See, so this is the physics stuff I don't understand well, but so the way that you get that generalization error equation, it's basically a random matrix theory argument, but there's various ways of deriving it, but one way is with physics type methods of like replica ansatz and stuff. But so this is the correlation functions between X, I guess, X and X prime, right? So it's I guess one way of thinking about these kernels is you have as a Gaussian process on the network itself as being a Gaussian process. So you can think of it as a prior. If you sample a lot of these random networks as like a Gaussian process of functions. But I'm not sure what you mean by a field of functions.
I mean, like just if you this phi, you just view it as a field. But just instead of having the manifold, you have this X input. And then it's like exactly you have the Hilbert space of these quantum fields, and then the correlation functions. Like and then the Feynman diagrams is just one computational method to compute this kind of scalar product in a general Hilbert space. And I was thinking if maybe probably you could also maybe use it to apply it also in this setting.
So certainly a lot of physicists, theoretical physicists have been attacking this sort of a theory. One branch that people have done is the finite n correction. So, or finite, I guess I called it m. So as my number of features, my kernel was as the number of features went to infinity, but say my number of features is finite, what are the corrections I get? So a lot of work out of Andrea Montanari's group is focused on that. And then there's also work on tangent kernel thing is like linearizing around the initial state, but then you can do nonlinear extra Taylor expansion terms beyond that and study that. People have looked at that. So I'm not sure. Yeah, you should check it out. Is what I would say. The literature is actually growing quite large. I've been more focused on what kind of things you can say. Basic theory, just by putting in more, structure to the networks, rather than pretty much all the theory that's out there is for Gaussian IID weights. Anybody else in Beijing have a question? One more here. Cool.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, Beijing, please. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I'm wondering in your random receptive kernel, do you have a critical line like the random Gaussian kernel in deep learning field? Yeah.
What do you mean by critical line?
Yeah, I know some theoretical work in deep learning, like they find a critical line of the weight bias, weight variance and Bayer variance, where they found in this kind of variance, the network has the best trainability. So I'm curious, in your random receptive kernel, do you have a similar critical line?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly, but so you're saying with certain biases, with variances and stuff, that you'll get better trainability, and that can be described by the tangent kernel, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but maybe that would be the kind of thing that could explain why the ConvNet wasn't helped by the structured weights. In fact, it was hurt a little bit, versus this MNIST being helped by it. I guess you're referring to some sort of phase transition happening, but I'm not really sure. Maybe you should look for it.
Yeah, thank you. And if I change our task to other kind of a feeling, or like our task is now focused on visual task like MNIST, CIFAR10. So if we change our task into other module, like should we change our random kernel into other biological structure?
Maybe, yeah. So I mean, I guess what my perspective is that, so people who study these kernel things, they typically choose for weights to be, ID, no covariance structure. If you know something about the kind of task and what sort of features are useful, you maybe can create a kernel model for it that's more informative than that completely structured model.
Okay.
At the moment, so it's just. And you learn the readout once.
And the readout. Yep.
Is there any way you could backprop to the parameters of the randomly generated weights and update those? Well, with that, like with some reparameterization trick thing, or would that be weird?
That would be interesting. Yeah, I don't know, like parameterize the covariance of the Gaussian process that generates the weights. That would be really interesting. I don't know what that would do, but maybe that has to do with, maybe that's one way of understanding what's happening when weights are actually being learned. Because I think you can yeah, good idea.
I guess that is the regime that the NT for the initialization.
Yeah, so the NTK is when you've scaled either the step size or something about the weights so that the weights don't change very much. Yeah. Okay, maybe we should take a break. Thanks a lot for all the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. Could you also send us your slides, please?
Thanks, Beijing.
Okay, so we'll gather here at 2:30 for a talk by Aliyah.
8:30 in Beijing.